can't see a new plant without trying to grow it. So it doesn't matter where I am, anywhere in the world, if I see something new and different, I'll try to grab a piece of it or seed, or find somebody who has some seed, or at least take a picture and try to get the name and then get somebody else to go get that seed. Some way of collecting.
Flowered all through the winter for us.
So again, how lovely.
It's another plant that just keeps on giving.
Yeah.
Much like your good self, Derry.
Oh,
Giving us all these exciting plants. Some of these things can be quite expensive, but you know, it's better than wasting your money on a bottle of whiskey, I think. So I'd rather give me a plant anytime.
Hello and welcome to episode 18 of Talking Dirty. Over at East Ruston Old Vicarage, looking kind of charismatic in caramel, we have Alan Edward Herbert Gray, our very handsome and happy horticulturalist.
Well, I am happy. I mean, why not be happy? It's a lovely, lovely morning. I've been watching the weather on the television this morning, and there was a wonderful grey blank screen, and that was sent in by a weather watcher, and it was just fog. We haven't had that here this morning. It's got a little bit overcast now, but it was a beautiful morning earlier on. But anyway, over in Cambridgeshire, we have Thordis Maria Sophia Fridriksson looking absolutely, shall I say, couched up in coral. I'm not going to call that orange because it's not bright enough, but it's a lovely warm shade of coral. But, you know, she's done the great thing that she always does. She's matched it to her lipstick.
It's all about a strong lip. It's about the only makeup I can still be bothered with after 2020.
That's what your mother used to say. Yeah.
And joining us for the first time on the podcast, we have featured his wonderful wife, but we have Mr. Laver, Alexander Laver, our Master Arborist Extraordinaire. Welcome to Talking Dirty.
Well, yes, and hello.
He's just put the fire on, so he's smug. We might see layers stripped off as the podcast.
As we go, I might reveal more.
You can leave your hat on and all that. Do you have a middle name to bring to the party?
I do. I'm a Thomas in the middle.
Alexander Thomas Laver. You are obviously a tree specialist. How did that come about? I started off doing more sort of game and wildlife and estate management type stuff. That's what I wanted to do. So I headed off up to Newtonrigg in Cumbria. Now, Newtonrigg is famous for being a forestry college. So everybody that went through the doors of Newtonrigg, whatever unit you were doing, and mine was definitely very relevant to it, but you always seemed to get bolted on a forestry module. It was just part and parcel. And then anybody that was doing anything practical, you got to play with chainsaws as well. So that was kind of my introduction to the tree world. And then from there, I sort of finished my course, and it was at the time that all the hunting bans and things like that were happening and coming in. And all the estates were kind of, they were worried. They were thinking, is everything just going to stop? Our kind of, the way we do everything just going to kind of stop? And so everybody that had a job anywhere didn't move. So the job market at that point just went flat as a pancake for 2 years. Nobody was moving from an estate. So any kind of estate management, gamekeeping, deer management jobs, nothing. So I found myself then using my chainsaw. So instead of doing that, I then started subcontracting and going to the estates I had been working on to do sort of felling and thinning work and that kind of thing. And because I'd then sort of done that, I kept in touch with a couple of my forestry tutors. And Cumbria at that stage had a real problem with a lack of professional arborists. They've got the beautiful national parks, but the tree officers were really complaining. It's just nobody knows how to take care of these trees properly. So there's a charity called Cumbria Broadleaves, who I'm indebtedly grateful to, that had put on a sort of sponsored course in Cumbria, and they'd asked the colleges that, you know, they'd advertised it through their sort of membership. They'd asked the colleges to look for people that with background in sort of horticulture, some in sort of forestry, that kind of thing, that would be good candidates. And I got offered a place. So we did that for a summer. From there, I then learned how to climb, and then learned more about arboriculture.
It's the climbing aspect I would be deeply uncomfortable with, but which people forget about, that you do have to not just have all the knowledge about trees and how to manage them, but this extra skill as well.
Of not falling off, yeah. Yeah, definitely. It certainly adds to it. I mean, it's I joke to people sometimes that I now do a job my mother used to tell me off for doing when I was younger, because, you know, and even now I go and prune her willow tree, and she can't look, she can't watch, she just disappears somewhere else in the house. She can't come out when I'm busy working and doing stuff. Can't do it. So yeah, in some respects that's quite good fun. I mean, it's used to clamber around trees in the garden and down into the trees around the fen and bits and pieces where I grew up, just outside Ely. Was always clambering out and doing stuff. So yeah, or climbing up mountains. That was the other thing.
And Alan, obviously, we've heard you say before the importance of arborists for any gardener. It's unlikely, if you're into gardening, that you won't need an arborist at some point in your life.
Well, especially in these trying times when we're having these wonderful gales that we've had. I mean, in a recent gale here, we had 15 trees blow down, and they're probably slightly more than that in actual fact, but they're the immediate ones that we know of. And about 4 or 5 of those are large trees, large eucalypts and Monterey pines, all of which have got to be dealt with. And I'm a great one for, you know, Beth Chatto always used to say, right plant in the right place. I'm going to say the right man for the right job, because an awful lot of people, you know, they buy themselves a chainsaw, they've got no training, and they think, oh, well, I can just chop that up, you know, but there are techniques, tricks, and all the rest of it that they don't know, that people like Alexander does know. And you need to have somebody professional to do the job for you. And not only do they just do the job for you, but they also, if you're lucky, we've got a very good one in Ian Flatters, who lives locally to us. I mean, he's so tidy. I don't know whether it's anything to do with the fact that he comes with his wife, Jenny. It probably is.
I don't know. I think arborists in the UK especially, and we're quite sought after breed internationally. And I think it's just because of our garden, the way we see our gardens. We're quite tidy-minded gardeners in the UK. You know, you go across into Europe and they have a different sort of aesthetic with their gardens and ways. In the UK, if it's not left spick and span, oh dear, they're going to tut about you.
That's all they do.
But yeah, I know I take great pride about leaving a garden tidier than when I entered it. And if I'm doing tree pruning, especially, you kind of go into the garden, you sort of prune the trees, and then if the client walks out, the garden almost looks exactly the same, but the trees, you know, a little bit smaller, and it's achieved what they want, but they can't actually see where you've been in the tree. That's the biggest compliment to me. You know, it's just like, you know, soft touch. We've done the work. We've gained the extra light. They've seen all the waste come out of the garden, but they walk out again and go, I can't see where you've been. I think that's always the trick. Yeah.
Arguably, this is a time of year when even people who aren't gardeners or into trees suddenly start to notice them. It's that season when everybody looks up and sort of basks in the glory of autumn. It must be even better when you know the trees and you're kind of looking around. I mean, you look around all year, but there must be so much to enjoy now for an arborist.
Yes, definitely. I mean, it's I've sort of had just recently, we're in splendid isolation at the minute here at Laver HQ, because we've just went over to Belgium for a wedding. A lovely drive then all the way down through Thetford and all the beech woodlands and the birch through there, and the conifers, and you get all the larch and stuff, and then dropping down then. Heading down the M11 corridor is a bit boring, isn't it? I mean, that's just the same old planting mix, isn't it? I'm just like, and anything that's going to catch litter, anything that's going to stop people climbing out of their cars, climbing up the bank and trespassing, B, kind of species. But then when you got down into Kent and that kind of way, that was really interesting, seeing sort of the different, how autumn was looking differently just that few miles further south to where we were up in Norfolk and travelling through.
Of course, the other thing that you end up doing a lot is not just tree pruning and tree management, but a lot of hedge planting and hedge management as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's what I was doing yesterday. I mean, a glorious day yesterday. I'm sort of using this 14 days as an enforced holiday, and I've got this very long job list I never quite got to in the first lockdown.
It's worth saying for anyone who's wondering why Alexander is in isolation, basically went to a wedding and is now, stuck at home having to isolate, having been to Belgium. So you're trapped.
Terrible.
In North Norfolk, which is really not bad. Let's talk hedges then, because I know that there are plenty of people who want to plant a really nice mixed hedge, or a beautiful hedge for a crisp line, and they're looking for inspiration. So as someone who goes around managing lots of hedges for councils or clients, what would be your recommendations for what to plant and how to look after it?
Stay away from Lalandi, however cheap it may seem. Lalandi in the right place at the right time is very good as a screening species. Mix it in with a few other conifers in a kind of block screen, so far as sort of councils are concerned, or if a big development's happening and you want to screen off an unsightly sort of light industrial units and that kind of thing. Absolutely brilliant for that, as long as you give them enough room. If not, sort of Lalandis themselves just cost you more money than that you ever thought possible in the amount of time to look after them. And as soon as you let them get ahead of you, you're stuffed, because they're a species that won't ever come back from hardwood cuttings. So you can only ever trim the green off as far back as the edge of the green. Otherwise, you'll get these horrible brown patches, and you see it. You drive around and people have decided that, that hedge is too much, and they cut the side off it, and they're just left with a whole load of really quite horrible, skanky brown sticks, aren't they? I mean, it's what they're going to do then, put a fence up in
I seem to remember Alan once saying, you might as well just spray paint it green.
Oh, I know. That definitely is. I mean, especially with the sort of the little spider blight that we get on conifers as well. I've seen some people's hedges go completely brown within 2 seasons because they haven't thought, why is that going brown, and sort of addressed it. And it's quite an easy thing to address and get on top of. And then, I think the best thing is to get somebody out that's very good at spray painting and paint it green, especially if you get someone good, because if they'll take 3 greens and blend it in rather than just a solid kind of pool tapeable base.
I think, there almost ought to be Lalandii should come with a warning on it.
I think so. Yeah, a bit like cigarettes do. Government warning. Yeah.
A picture of one of those brown patches, on the plant.
Well, just like think about how these trees grow in the wild, and do you realise the finished height of this tree will be approximately 30 meters?
Alex, I think that's often why why some of the hedges fail, because they are basically trees that are tortured. But why don't people do? I mean, I remember going around the countryside, and I mean, there was a particular hedge that I used to go past quite regularly when I used to cycle to school. The hedge was a boundary hedge on a farmhouse, and it's only a small farmhouse. And at the end of the hedge, the chap who cut the hedge had fashioned it to look like a locomotive. So the train, I used to go past this train which just cut as a hedge, and on the other end there was a pheasant that had been, made out of topiary. It was and he did actually made a form and a form for get the tail feathers out and all the rest of it. And it was just beautifully done. I think people years ago used to do an awful lot more of that. They used to practice this kind of quirky individuality. I suppose they didn't have a television, so it's something to do in there.
Well, they wouldn't have been sitting on their laptops watching us, would they?
Well, they wouldn't, I suppose. No, you're absolutely right. They wouldn't.
We're distracting them. I think we're part of the problem here, Alan.
We can also be part of the solution.
Oh, well, there we go. Okay, that's a good. Well done. Well recovered.
Actually, I did see. I drove up a road I never normally drive. I took a different route yesterday, and someone has, not very far from me, has a massive, possibly blackbird, possibly pigeon, a kind of weird bird hybrid that are absolutely colossal at the end of their.
A working in progress. I think you find that's what that is. Yeah. That's a working in progress.
But years ago, it was a well-known fact that in the 19th century, wealthy people would go around the countryside, and they would, or they would be, wealthy people would probably be told that in a garden at so-and-so, there's a cottage garden, there's 2 wonderful dumpling ewes, 3 dumplings, one on top of the other, that kind of thing. And then the master of the house would send his man round to offer them money for them, and they would dig them up, but I'm getting money for something that cost me nothing. Dig them up, take them away to the big house and start a topiary garden or something.
So on the other side, I do think there's, if you move into a house like I do, there's kind of nothing there. So you move in, if you don't know about plants, or you are maybe a bit impatient like me, you're overlooked by houses. Nobody's planted anything in the past, so you haven't got a mature tree to bring some structure. So there is a kind of a need to move things along a bit quicker, because if you move into a garden and it's got trees and hedges and things, then you're that kind of step along. So I have a lot of sympathy.
Yeah, and then before you know it, you've got a Lalandi hedge down one side, a big clump of bamboo that is now 18 feet into your garden.
You see
you're
how it
wondering,
happens.
oh dear.
You see how it happens.
Yeah, it's an easy trap to fall into, I must admit.
So I said
I like the warning labels. I think we should do that on several parts.
I said we'd be part of the solution as well as the problem. What then is the quickest non-Leylandii solution? I mean, apart from putting up a massive fence and trellis, like what would be the next quickest growing or affordable at least hedge?
Yew is surprisingly fast growing. Everybody says, "Oh, yew takes forever to get going," and no, you if you prepare your ground properly, give it plenty of muck, manure, and get a bit of blood, fish, and bone. Just make sure what sort of soil you're putting it into. It's fairly tolerant of shade and that kind of thing as well. And as small plants, they're very vigorous. So you have one of those sort of understory trees that will sit quietly and wait for their opportunity. So they'll sow, and if you wander through woodlands with yew in them, you'll see that they sort of self-set about, the birds self-set them about, and you'll see these little trees popping up, and you think, oh, that's quite a young tree, that's quite small. But it may sit there quietly in the shade, not really getting much, and it could easily be 10 years old. But it looks like it's only just popped up 2 years ago. And then suddenly it'll got an opportunity, a tree will blow over in that woodland, it'll get the light, and away it goes. So when you get sort of young yew stock plants and you plant them out, you're giving them that opportunity of light and getting away. And they're actually in that very first part of their sort of cycle, they're in that young growing phase, and they grow quite quickly. Now, if you make the mistake and try and get them too big, that's your problem with you. So if people try and get, we'll get a bit of instant hedge isn't so bad because they've treated it the right way. But if they get like pot grown yews and they think, well, we'll get them 3-4 foot, oh look, we can get them 5 foot straight out of the bag, but they want to achieve a 7-8 foot hedge maybe, or a 6 foot hedge. What happens then? They get planting shock, and you don't actually get the hedge filling up. And I think that's where they've got their reputation of being really slow growing and not establishing particularly well. So if you do your due diligence, you look after them and plant them well, and buy a little bit smaller, what you'll find is you'll fill a hedge out very, very quickly. And they clip beautifully.
I'm going to agree with that, except for one thing, because I think good husbandry is the basic commodity that you have to give it a hedge of any kind anyway. Let's just say we're buying yew trees 45 centimeters, 18 inches tall. We're buying yew plants. We're putting they're bare root. They come with a root wrapped or something like that. Leave that wrapping on, plant them properly in good soil. Make sure you feed and water them. They will grow 8 inches a year. And people think that's easy. Not much, but it is when you have to go and cut it. Back to one of the last things you said, Alexander, that people can, in actual fact, buy yews 3-4 feet tall and then want a hedge 6 to 8 feet tall. Well, that is exactly what we did here. When we bought extra land, we wanted a hedge around our driveway. And the only yew hedging that we could find was, in actual fact, a fastigiate yew. And they were around about a meter and a bit tall, root wrapped. We planted them, and I have to say they have made a most wonderful hedge. And I think probably because we gave them the attention that they deserved, not just because we wanted them to grow properly, but we didn't want to waste our money either. And they have done very, very well. But I mean, it does take that diligence.
I was just thinking of other good examples of hedges that will do you well long term. Beech is one that you've got to be confident you haven't got any armillaria or honey fungus or anything like that about. So I'd always go for hornbeam over beech if ever I had a choice. But a hornbeam hedge is lovely because it holds its leaf so well. And then if you want some red robins and you want to grow them into hedge, they do make a very lovely hedge, Mr. Gray.
Well, Mr. Laver, I'm going to disagree with you completely because we have two sides to our garden here at East Ruston. One side we planted with beech hedge because that's the hedge of our choice. And beech also holds onto its leaves in the winter as well.
Yeah.
And with the other side, because we've got beech one side of the garden, the other side we decided we'd use hornbeam just in case there's some disease befell beech.
Bit of resilience.
We're hedging our bets. Hornbeam looks drab and dreary in the winter because the leaves go to a dull khaki colour, but the leaves of beech
that's all taste.
The russet colour that glows in the low rays of the winter sunshine. So I would disagree with you there. But the only thing I would say between the two is that beech likes a sandier, a lighter soil. Yes. Hornbeam will tolerate a wetter soil. So yes, there are things that you have to take into consideration when you're choosing to have a hedge. But why not have a mixed hedge? I mean, I'm sort of thinking that some of our hedges are mixed hedges here. They're almost like field boundary type hedges, but we cut them and we manage them. Field maple, for instance, it goes this wonderful butter yellow, as Nancy say, in the autumn, and it's absolutely lovely. It's a very good plant for hedges. Hawthorn, and I've got beech and I've got holly. Now into those two, you will get, into those four plants, you will get, that's a nice mixture for wildlife. There's nothing evergreen in there, but birds will introduce ivy because they'll eat the ivy seeds and pull at the top of the hedge and drop it down to the bottom, and up goes an ivy. But so does honeysuckle. Just think how lovely that is when you're roaming around your estate in the evenings and suddenly in May, June, you get this waft of wonderful perfume from honeysuckle. But you're also going to get a couple of bad boys in there, I have to say. You're going to get brambles. Now, if you want to harvest lots of blackberries, you leave them, but you'll lose your hedge. And the other thing is the dog rose, which is very romantic and very pretty, the English dog rose. But, nobody wants to go near those two plants because they're packed with thorns that are very injurious. So they're two that you need to get rid of. But I think a mixed hedge is absolutely lovely. Before we leave hedges, one thing I do rather like the idea of, and we did it here for a while, but then we took them out because they were in the wrong place. But there's a funny plant it's an evergreen plant, and it's called Ligustrum japonicum. Well, Ligustrum is a privet, and Ligustrum japonicum is evergreen. It's got slightly oval leaves, but it's got this weird habit of growth where it sort of grows in sort of bumpy shapes. And,
okay. So it makes a lovely cloud prune.
Absolutely. This is like a naturally cloud pruned hedge, which you can exaggerate if you want to. Yeah. Which brings us back, kind of thing, doesn't it, to the people doing the topiarized bits and pieces in their garden. And I think that would be a very quick way of,
those sort of privets work very well for that kind of quick topiary, and you see that in the sort of the slightly less expensive end of the topiary market. You see them using.
I think you're talking about, Alex, the small leaf ones, which you need to clip more than once a year. Like Ligustrum japonicum, you don't need to clip more than once a year.
Oh, well, that's excellent then, yeah.
Because that's relatively slow growing. But I mean, always remember the cardinal rule about hedging plants is the faster it grows, the more you've got to clip it. I mean, take the old Ligustrum period, privet. I mean, it grow 2 or 3 feet wands.
If you want a really nice tight hedge, I'd say. Yeah, easy. Yeah.
Right. So after all of our tree and hedge talk with our Master Arborist, what have you brought for show and tell, Alexander Laver?
What have I brought for show and tell? Where do you want the show to come from? I mean, it's there you go.
Oh,
so
look at this.
What I've got here is a great book, and it's only been out a couple of years. Now, this is it's a superb book. It's called The Essential Pruning Techniques, Trees, Shrubs and Conifers. And it was written originally by a chap called Georgie Brown. And then in more recent years, Tony Kirkham, who is the man behind Kew Gardens these days, so he's the creator down at Kew Gardens, revised this and modernized this. And it is an absolutely superb book. So if you've got anything, I mean, there's bits of hedges in here. There's lovely detail in the back for each of the different species. So all throughout here, we can choose any kind of species that you've got in your garden, and it will tell you the sort of way that that tree wants to grow. So it'll give you its sort of blueprint and its form, and then it will give you how you can then prune and reduce that, and what it will tolerate, what it won't tolerate. So it's a really useful guide and a useful book. There's even a section here when your bamboos get a little bit out of control, Thordis, bamboos. But then at the front end of the book, what we've got is a whole guide on different tree forms. So it also helps you not only with sort of pruning and doing that, but it helps you think about what tree that you want and what shape and form that you want in the first place. So if you were starting from a bare patch, I know it sounds crazy to get a book on pruning and looking after it, but actually start with a bit of research on, okay, what forms do I want to get to? What do I want to manipulate? And if we go back to sort of topiary, that's a classic one really, of what do I want to manipulate? What do I want to get? So right tree, right place, right plant, right place is really important. But then there are some things that we can manipulate and do funky things with that will cope really well with it, rather than getting something in there and then trying to do that and realizing it's a species it's not going to play ball. You know, it's just going to beat you up and frustrate you, and it'll die, or it'll do whatever. But then there's really good detail on pruning techniques, and then different kinds of pruning cuts to use for sort of different species and selections. So there you go, Mr. Kirkham. There's a good book advert for you. Just remember that next time I'm down at Kew, the Italian restaurant just around the corner is superb. I really enjoyed the last time we went there.
So from show and tell to FLOMO, mine isn't a tree or a hedge, but it's something that, you know, if I ever end up with a tree big enough, I could grow through it. After we had Ian Roof on this podcast, and we got sucked into Clematis and Clematis rehderiana, I then kind of got transported into a Clematis vortex online. And actually, for anyone who can't remember what FLOMO is, or who hasn't encountered FLOMO before, perhaps this is the first time you're listening to this podcast. It's that kind of fear of missing out you get when you see a plant that you want, that you haven't got. And looking through, as someone who only has a couple of Clematis, looking through this Clematis website, oh, I just wanted so many of them. I finally settled on the one I wanted the most was Swedish bells, because I'm a sucker for any kind of like nice bell-like flower. And I wondered, Mr. Gray, whether you knew Swedish bells and whether or not I should get it.
I don't know Swedish bells in actual fact, but I mean, is this a winter flowering Clematis?
Sounds more like an exotic dancer to me.
It looks a bit more like an exotic dancer. I don't
That's
think it is.
thinking, Alex.
I don't think it is winter flowering, but
No.
I must confess I'm not much of a Clematis expert.
Well, I think talking about Clematis for a minute. I mean, if we can, I mean, not much to say, not really, but it's worth exploring some of the winter flowering Clematis, because if you've got a very sheltered spot, or even a cold greenhouse or a cold conservatory, those winter flowering Clematis make superb plants for those sheltered places, because often their flowers, they get bashed about by the weather and things like that. And there's not much flowering in the winter time. But if you've got a cold greenhouse or a cold conservatory, you get one of those in a pot and they'll open for you. I mean, it's amazing how hot it can get underneath the glass, and it just urges them along a little bit. And I just think that some of the winter flowering Clematis are well worth, shall we say, bothering with, because you know, it's the kind of time when people are not often in their gardens, but if you've got them in a cold greenhouse, or you know, in a conservatory that adjoins the house, what joy they give you through the dark months.
The one thing I did discover the more I looked into Clematis was how many of them seemed to suggest they wanted freer draining soil than I can provide. Well,
I think yes. Well, I mean, one of the things that Clematis really do like is a shaded root run. So, you know, give them, dig some gravel into the soil. And if you can't give them a shaded root run, we'll put a 2-inch mulch of gravel over the top of the root area. Because the one thing about gravel is, even in the hottest days, if you pull it apart, it's always moist underneath, thanks to the condensation that occurs. So just bear that in mind, that gravel will give you wonderful moisture retentive qualities, and a little bit dug into the soil improves the drainage as well.
You see a lot of people using old broken pan tiles and that kind of thing as well, just to sort of lay over the top and shade roots. But it's also great, and anything like that is always great for catching that bit of moisture, isn't it? And keeping,
it is.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the great things, if you plant other plants around the base of your clematis, all those other plants are going to be taking moisture out of the soil, whereby if you give it a gravel mulch, a nice medium-sized grit or heavy-sized grit, even if it's on the surface, you're keeping that moisture there.
Yes, and then if it's looking a little bit unsightly, that's where the pot goes in front rather than planting up the ground. Yeah.
Now, Alexander, when we were having our pre-podcast production chat, I think you were kind of intimating there was a lot of FLOMO in your life, because your wife, who's already featured on this podcast, the award-winning garden designer Tamara Bridge, probably has first dibs on a lot of the planting spots in your garden.
Yes. Definitely, because she'll be experimenting with different things, or she'll be trying something new for a client, and she'll get a few herself and give them a go and look at combinations and that kind of thing. So real estate in our garden is quite limited. So I'm quite lucky with some of the trees that we inherited when we first moved in, and I've campaigned for a long time to keep one conifer in there. Which I think Tamara's finally decided that conifers are good in the right place at the right time. It's a lovely slow glowing cypress. So that's lovely. But yeah, I dearly love a nice sort of chunk of land to plant an arboretum and some sort of screening and some woodland around. So my list of FLOMO, probably tree wise, is quite long and various, I'd say.
So if you could steal, if Tamara wasn't looking and you could steal one planting spot, what do you think would go in first?
I'd go for something really small. I was thinking about this, so I'll have to be tactical. There, let me get the right spelling for it. But I found there's somebody I did some work from a couple of years ago, not so far away from here in Swaffham, has a lovely collection of, I think they started getting into sort of bonsais and they got too big, so they planted them in the garden. They've got a lovely collection of very small trees and quite interesting little miniature mountain trees and pines and that kind of thing. And I did fall in love with a lovely little one from New Zealand, which is called the mountain rimaru, or the pygmy pine. And that's the tiniest little thing. But I think that's just great, because I think I like the idea of that whole tree structure being quite small. I quite like the idea of bonsais, and I've played around with those sometimes. But what you're doing there is you're kind of manipulating something to be small. Whereas this naturally grows very small, and you can really see how the sort of plant growth structures work and how each reiteration of its sort of blueprint works. So yeah, I think that would be great. One of those.
Pygmy pine, that sounds brilliant.
Yeah.
Right then, Alan, what is your FLOMO this week?
Mine is something I already have, but I've been reading about another variety of it, and it's actually Cupressus cashmeriana. And I don't know whether any of you can remember visiting large country houses, and quite often in the orangery of some of these large country houses, there was this wonderful weeping glaucous blue-grey cedar, Cupressus, I mean, and it just used to have these lovely pendant tassels of this lovely blue-grey foliage, and I always loved them. And I remember being able to get one, and it came from Burncoos and Southdown nurseries in Cornwall, and we grew it in a pot in the greenhouse or conservatory for years and years and years. Got too big, put it in the garden, it never looked back. We were always told they weren't hardy, and probably they weren't in those days.
Be all right, it's climate change and we're in Norfolk.
Yeah, well, exactly that, yeah. But I was reading about a Cupressus cashmeriana put on the internet by Pan Global, and the owner of that nursery is called Nick Mesa, and he's one of these. He's a lovely fella, and he's one of these guys that just down tools and goes off plant hunting. And he's got a Cupressus cashmeriana, and it's got a number KR8688A, Assamica in brackets beneath it, next to it. It comes from the Western Arunachal Pradesh. and it is the true species, which is hardier than the one in general cultivation, and it is the very, very best and most beautiful of the Cashmeriana conifers. So I want to get one of those just to say, well, just to say I've got it really. But I mean, if it's hardier, I want to, and if it's more beautiful, I want to know about it, and I want to compare it to my ordinary Cupressus Cashmeriana. So I'm just looking for that tree that comes from the Western Arunachal Pradesh. That sounds exotic, doesn't it?
Really does. That sounds very exciting. Wow. Well, let's go from your where was it from again?
Western Arunachal Pradesh.
We'll go from your
Pradesh, sorry.
Your very exciting and exotic Cupressus to a couple of quick questions before we have to wind things up on Talking Dirty. We've had some questions come in. One of them was in response to Alan's insanely popular lavender video. Anyone who's ever wanted to grow lavenders from cuttings, you need to check out Alan's video, because something like a couple of 100,000 people have been enjoying Alan across the world telling them how to take lavender cuttings. And one of those people is Helen, who's come across your video at the wrong time. She wants to know if she can do this now in November. What do you say to that, Alan?
No, I would just say frankly, no. But as an alternative to that, I always sort of think it's best to have a go. But the problem with doing it in November is it's too cold. The hours of daylight are reducing rapidly now, and you know the less daylight there is, the more difficult it is for cuttings to root. And if they do root, what are they going to do then? I mean, there's no good sunshine or daylight to encourage them to grow. So I would say, by and large, it is too late. If you have a propagator, why don't you have a go and just see what happens? You might not get a great take from a batch of cuttings. The last batch of cuttings that I took of lavender was in August. The end of August, beginning of September, and that is really too late. You really need to do them in July if you can. And they're just so easy in a gritty compost. I mean, I remember years ago, we used to pack 70 cuttings into a seed box, 70 lavender cuttings into a seed box, and you put them somewhere, somewhere sheltered outside with a pane of glass over the top, and they rooted like whoop, as they say. And then you pop them on individually and off you go. So basically, I would say, the ideal time is July, but, Helen, have a go.
Have a go with a bit of bottom heat.
Yes.
Bit of bottom. We all like that.
And then we also had an email from Craig in Glasgow. You can email hello@getgardeningnow.co.uk with your question. You can attach photos as Craig did. And he spotted something on the leaves of his palm. He wondered whether, Alan, you knew what it might be, and does it mean he needs to get rid of the plant?
Well, it looks, it's difficult to judge from a photograph because here we are on a small computer screen, laptop size screen, and it's difficult to judge, but it looks like some form of aphid infestation, which it doesn't seem to be too serious to me. I would use something called SP Plant Invigorator. It doesn't hurt anything else. And what it basically does, you spray it onto these aphids, and it works its way through the waxy coating on their bodies, and it prevents them breathing, and they snuff it. But Plant Invigorator is the thing as well, because that gives the plant some foliar feed, that invigorates it into come on, let's get on with it. But I think the thing I would have to say to Craig is spray it every day for 5 days, and then every 3 days, at least for 2 weeks, because you've got a Plant Invigorator. It once you've sprayed it, it's gone. It doesn't remain and doesn't stay, and it's kind of a gentle way of dealing with the problem, shall I say, and it's not going to interfere with anything else, but you've got to do it little and often to make sure that you get rid of the pest. But SB Plant Invigorator. There's your answer.
Keep the questions coming in. We'll answer them on a future podcast. But for now, thank you very much, Alexander Thomas Laver, our Master Arborist Extraordinaire, for joining us on the podcast and talking trees and hedges and all things fun and planty.
Thank you very much, Alex. Lovely to see you all. Bye-bye.
Bye. Happy gardening. I can't see your face, Mr. Gray.
Yes, you can.
Oh, no. Oh, yes, I can. He is, as if by
connecting.
He's nearly connected.
So I haven't got down here quick enough to get the fire going.
Oh no!
Little stove and fire. So I'm like,
start it.
Don't start. Well, I'll get the fire on. 1 second. I'll leave you to the workshop. You can have lots of nosies behind you. It's all safe. I've checked, Alan. It's all good.